soon. I am very pleased to introduce Simon Weppel, who is a colleague and friend of mine from when I did my PhD at the Cambridge Heritage Research Center in Cambridge. Simon Weppel is a PhD candidate and Cambridge Trust Scholar at the Cambridge Heritage Research Center, University of Cambridge, UK. He holds a BA from the Free University Berlin, an MPhil from the University of Cambridge, and has spent time at Boğaziçi University Istanbul, sorry about that, and Sciences Po Paris. His doctoral project studies the development of heritage preservation in the later Soviet Union. So I'm really excited to hear about this development kind of ideas of heritage centering on these museums connected to Lenin and also the connections to Soviet perceptions of the past, present, and future. So without further ado, I will introduce Simon Weppel.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for the introduction, and thank you also for the invitation, and thank you, Ineken, as well. So I hope you can hear me and I hope you can see everything. The title of my paper today is, as you can see, Stepping Over the Threshold of Time, the Rise of Heritage in the Brezhnev-Era Soviet Union. Now, this paper is chiefly based on my doctoral research, on my dissertation, which I have just finished at the University of Cambridge, and over the next 40 to 45 minutes, I'll be giving you an insight into this research, and by the end of the paper, I hope you'll have gained an understanding of who is stepping over the threshold of time, in what way, why this happened in the Brezhnev era, and so on. Now, I want to start by showing you two quotes referring to a Soviet museum dedicated to Vladimir Lenin. Both quotes are taken from visitor guidebooks, and they concern themselves with how to best honor Lenin in his hometown, his city of birth, Ulyanovsk. The first quote is from 1961, and it reads as follows. Now perhaps Lenin would already not recognize his hometown, the Volga's banks. The new Ulyanovsk towers like a monument to Lenin. The greatest service to Lenin is building today the Ulyanovsk of tomorrow. In 1978, the same authors write the following. The residents of Ulyanovsk entertain an at all times careful and protective relationship to the history of their city. There is no task more noble than the preservation of the city, exactly as the young Vladimir Ulyanov, Lenin, saw it. And I think you see what I'm trying to get at here. There's a clear shift here between these quotes. The first quote basically says forward, into the future, onward, whereas the second one is much more concerned with preservation and conservation. And these are the same authors, so this is not just a difference of opinion between two different authors, but there really seems to be this change of perspective that seems to have taken place between those two quotes. And it is exactly the shift towards an appreciation of the old, towards an appreciation of heritage that I'll be talking to you about today. And in order to explain to you a little bit how this research project came about, I want to first tell you a little story about the genesis of my study. So when I started my PhD about 3.5 years ago, I had just completed my master's in heritage at Cambridge, and I had written my dissertation on the topic of the contemporary significance, that means the post-Soviet significance of the memory of Vladimir Lenin to the aforementioned city of Ulyanovsk in Russia. And this was very much a study that was focusing on the today. And when I started on my PhD, I was trying to scale up this project, looking at more museums in different contexts. And one museum that really caught my interest and was recommended to me by some of my contacts in Ulyanovsk was the museum in Shushenskoye, a very remote place in Siberia, as you can see here on the map, in southern Krasnoyarsk Krai, not far from the border with Mongolia, actually. And this is also the museum that we'll be looking at as a case study today. So for the pilot study of my PhD, I traveled in 2019 to this quite remote place, whose connection to Lenin is actually that this is where he was exiled to in 1897 to 1900. So he spent 3 years here at the turn of the century. And so in Shushenskoye, I tried to apply similar methods to those that I used in my master's dissertation in order to find out how this museum had adapted within the last 30 years, the time after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But as I did this research, I eventually had to admit to myself that this line of inquiry wasn't quite as fruitful as I thought it was. There wasn't that kind of tension in Shushenskoye, in contemporary Shushenskoye. Shushenskoye seemed to have moved on from Lenin a long time ago. And as I tried to get to the bottom of this, I gradually discovered something that I found much more interesting than my original research aim. Now, the heart of Shushenskoye, which you see here, is this quite large museum village. And this is really a product of the late 1960s. So this entire village, this entire world really, was specifically created as a so-called museum reserve, Muzej Zapovednik, in the years 1968 to 1970. And the more I looked into the context of this museum project, the motivations of its planners, the more I became convinced that the true shift, the real breaking point at these sites that I looked at was not 1991, but rather somewhere actually in the late 1960s. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, 1970, that was the 100-year jubilee of Lenin's birth, so that explains the transformation at these heritage sites. But as we will see, this was not only a transformation at scale, it wasn't just influx of a lot of construction or money, but there was really a reflection of new perspectives on heritage sites and on history as such, as I tried to show in these initial two quotes. And looking at sources from this time period, such as newspaper articles, guidebooks, official assessments, and comparing them to earlier materials, I saw that these new perspectives usually differed in how they presented two things: space, and to an even larger degree, actually time. And time, and this is something I will return to, has always played a significant role in Soviet society. I'm thinking here in particular with the notion of temporality, of cultural temporality, by which I mean to refer simply to the collective set of notions about time, about direction in time, about history that exist in a given group, in this case within Soviet society. Now, literary scholar Katerina Clark wrote that Soviet culture has always been grounded in a particular temporal model. But in my research, actually, there is also a shift in temporal model that I will demonstrate to you in this paper. Clark is, of course, right. She refers to this perhaps classical Soviet ideological notion of the triumph of communism that is just on the horizon, with Soviet achievements in science and technology sure to bring about this amazing Soviet future. So this was a temporality that traditionally was always quite future-oriented, from the time of the constructivists and futurists in the revolutionary period, all the way up to Khrushchev, who promised in 1961 that the then current generation of Soviet citizens will definitely live under communism. But actually what I found in Shushenskoye made me wonder, how does this supposed confidence in the future fit together with this creation of heritage spaces in the 1960s and in the later 1960s? Was there perhaps something that had happened that had created a need for heritage in some way? So this pilot study that I carried out in Shushenskoye led me to reassess my research aims, and I began to wonder, what was the relationship between changing notions of time and discourses of heritage in the Soviet Union? And based on my preliminary research, I decided that the best way to approach this question was through an analysis of sites with high ideological significance to the Soviet state, sites that, because they had been in the focus of attention, could be said not to be merely isolated cases, but rather representative of wider trends and tendencies. At the same time, these sites had to be locations that carried some form of perceived historic significance if an analysis of discourses of heritage was to be meaningful. So I decided on building on my preliminary research, I decided on this small number of Lenin museums as points of inquiry for this thesis. Now, these were always in the focus of the Soviet state. These sites of remembrance, commemoration of Lenin were subject to considerable changes over the course of the Soviet era, with contents and narratives varying according, of course, to political necessity and cultural mood. So in order to answer that main research question, I kind of split my study up into two different questions. I looked at how heritage management strategies and modes of exhibition at these Lenin museums changed between roughly 1960 and 1985, basing this broad time frame on my research where I had identified this kind of break around the year 1970. And importantly, I also looked at how the way official visitor materials talk about museums related to Lenin changed within this period. So there's this kind of dual approach. On the one hand, this was a historical discourse analysis. I looked at guidebooks, tourist brochures, and similar materials to understand basically the official presentation of these sites. What was the visitor meant to take away here? And this was quite a close reading because there's of course always this very strong Soviet ideological language, Lenin, the great teacher, and so on. But actually, as I will show you, there are some quite telling omissions, phrases that change over the years that show there is something happening in the background, almost on the unconscious level in how these sites were perceived or meant to be perceived. And these guidebooks are a fantastic source because they were usually published in several editions, sometimes spanning 15 to 20 years under the same authorship. So I think the differences between these editions can be and have been quite illuminating. And I combined this historical discourse analysis with what is usually called a site biography approach in order to have the context of the actual changes happening in exhibition practice at these sites. New buildings were built, preservation guidelines were changed, and so on. And this, of course, tells you just as much as what's in these guidebooks. So now let's look at Shushenskoye and see what kind of specific data I found during my research there. And while we do so, I will also introduce some of the conceptual tools and approaches that I've used in and developed in my work. So in terms of site biography, Lenin left Shushenskoye in 1900, and judging by the letters he wrote and that were published in the Soviet era, he didn't like it very much. He hated this village. He described it as dull, dirty, dusty. He wrote there's manure lying around everywhere. He really seemed to have hated it. He left in 1900 and never returned to Shushenskoye, but already shortly after he died in 1924, there was a discussion amongst the local and regional authorities about how to use the fact that Lenin stayed there to their benefit and for the creation of some sort of educational space in the house that Lenin stayed in. And I specifically didn't use the word commemorate here. They didn't necessarily seek to commemorate Lenin, because when you look at what kind of spaces they created, this is not really a commemoration. Now, eventually there was a plaque at the end of the 1920s on one of these buildings, but the spaces itself much rather fulfilled the functions of an izba czytelnia, a hut, a cottage that sort of served as an educational and agitational hub, spreading literacy and also, of course, Soviet propaganda. And this kind of educational and agitational space was really what this museum stayed up until the late 1960s. Now, in the Stalinist era, there were a number of changes that revolved around the supposedly correct interpretation of Soviet history. The site had to conform to what was in Stalin's short course. Institutionally, the museum was moved under the umbrella of the Central Lenin Museum, which made sure that all of the Lenin sites told the same story, and so on. Now, in 1959, the museum still described its own mission as the promotion of the heroic struggle of the party and people for communism on the basis of genuine documents of the revolutionary struggle and the promotion of the example of Lenin's life and work, as well as the education of workers contributing to their transformation into active builders of communism. At the same time, in the 50s and early to mid 60s, a lot of the village of Shushenskoye was the focus of beautification efforts, so благоустройство, efforts that were basically pointing back at these complaints that Lenin had had half a century ago. So they planted a lot of plants. The nearby riverbank of the Yenisei was reworked so that visitors could enjoy it better. And everything was made so that visitors could enjoy Shushenskoye, but also convince themselves of this transformative power that the Soviet Union had. set in contrast to Lenin's complaints about Shushenskoye. So let's keep this in mind. So up until this time, the late 1960s, Shushenskoye is really a place that in documents predominantly points towards the future. It talks about the builders of communism, prides itself into this transformation, this transformative power, this beautification as a way of overcoming this dark and dusty past that Lenin criticized. And Shushenskoye in the earlier period was meant to be an example of leaving the past behind for something better through progress and education, similar to that first quote we saw at the beginning of the presentation. And then around the year 1968, something very interesting happens. In the context of the 100th birthday of Lenin in 1970, the party comes up with a grand plan, which you can see on this slide. Shushenskoye, which until then was a living village with people building new houses, old houses being torn down and so on, was to be turned fully into a so-called memorial zone. It was decided that Shushenskoye was basically to be split in two, with the whole of the historic village turned into a museum reserve and its inhabitants resettled just outside the museum perimeter. And this new project was suddenly motivated, as we'll see, by quite different values and priorities. Chiefly, this was a quest for authenticity, an attempt to restore Shushenskoye to how it was at the end of the 19th century. Several institutions worked together to reconstruct Shushenskoye according to how it had looked at the time of Lenin. Some houses were reconstructed anew. In some cases, the planners found materials that had once been in Shushenskoye in nearby towns and moved it back into this reserve. And this was not only a project that sought outwards authenticity, but also aimed to restore faithfully the interiors of that time. For instance, in the local newspaper, the following call to residents of the area was published, with the writer asking, "Where did antique pre-revolutionary items of daily life survive? Cookware, weaving looms, spinning wheels, kerosene lamps, old plows, all of this will be placed into the peasant houses and courtyards of Shushenskoye that are being restored in the memorial zone, so that visitors will have a full understanding of the everyday culture and life of the population of Shushenskoye during the time of Lenin's exile." So this material culture, these surroundings that had earlier been dismissed as backward, suddenly carry some real interest, some real heritage value. And very strikingly, these architects even attempt to restore the nature around Shushenskoye to how Lenin would have seen it. So the riverbank was renaturalized after having been made more tourist friendly in the 50s and early 60s. And the lake that Lenin used to go fishing at had silted up in the meantime. So it was cleared out in order to appear like it did at the end of the 19th century. And the planners and commentators of this whole enterprise start to praise Shushenskoye for something quite different, for qualities that did not play a role before. For example, one of the leading conservators working in Shushenskoye, Ivan Makovetsky, praises the completion of the museum reserve in the following words, quote, "Shushenskoye is remarkable because here, for the first time in the USSR, an old village, including its setup of residential, utility, and public buildings, is restored in its original location. Here it is as if the visitor steps over the threshold of time and becomes a participant of those distant years. The significance of the museum will grow with every year," end quote. Another architect, Boris Gnidovsky, writes that, quote, "Meticulous restoration of all the details of daily life means that the visitor may steep himself in the bygone atmosphere of the village, just as though he were living the life of the time. In fact, were this not the case, there would be no point creating a memorial museum of the type in our day," end quote. So this is a striking difference, I think, from how the museum was conceived prior to the creation of this reserve, this sterilized, you might say, perfect environment. And one methodological kind of concept or tool that I've been trying to grasp this with is actually the Chronotope of Michael Bakhtin, which for Bakhtin referred to the, quote, intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships that are artistically expressed in literature, end quote. But that I suggest to use as an analytical tool, actually, of looking exactly at these connections of space and time, of looking either into the future or toward the past, looking outward or looking inward at heritage sites. And I think that this kind of spatial and temporal analysis of Shushenskoye shows us two things. Spatially, that Shushenskoye changes from this educational and agitational perspective that seeks to spur people into action beyond the perimeter of the museum, to one that actually invites people into a kind of protected space, that invites people to immerse, as we have seen, immerse themselves in the atmosphere of the past, to escape the outside world. And on the temporal level, of course, Shushenskoye stops pointing towards the future, stops pointing at the Soviet ability to improve and to leave a dark and dusty past behind. Instead, it begins to highlight authenticity, the preservation of historical surroundings. It attempts to restore the past. So, in my opinion, there's this strong shift in chronotope in Shushenskoye at this time. And before we talk about why this might be, I want to show you how an analysis of the guidebooks in Shushenskoye underlines this research, how it becomes quite clear that there are these two periods of Shushenskoye with quite different chronotopes. One looking outward and towards the future, the second after around 1968 to 1970, very much focused on immersion and preservation. Now, I looked at 54 guidebooks from Shushenskoye, most of which came from the Khrushchev and Brezhnev periods. And in the guidebooks from the 50s and early 1960s, Shushenskoye as a site connected to Lenin is again presented as having an educational and inspirational function, a visit to which is intended to inform visitors' actions outside of the museum. There are constant metaphors pointing towards the future, describing a showing of the way and so on. One guidebook calls Lenin a torch lighting the way into the future. Another one proclaims, if we all live like Lenin, our future is ensured. Another author compares Lenin's works written in Shushenskoye to a lighthouse guiding all working people of the world. At the same time, the past is actually condemned, and the booklets use a great number of negative adjectives to characterize Shushenskoye to the reader. Shushenskoye is described as dirty, dusty, backwards, out of the way, Lenin's exile as cruel, and Lenin's surroundings are described as hostile. So this is a past in Shushenskoye that we don't want to go back to. This is almost a past that scares you, where the reader perhaps should be thankful that Soviet power is making us go far away from this. And again, in the late 1960s, the tone in the guidebooks gradually changes. At first, in 1966 and 1967, two guidebooks quote visitors to express a certain uneasiness with the way that Shushenskoye had been beautified. They write that, quote, it is regrettable that none of the outbuildings which witnessed our great teacher's hard life in the Siberian exile have been preserved. After all, a large number of today's visitors say, without hesitation and under the impression of the modern surroundings, that in fact the exile for Lenin was more like a sanatorium, end quote. Another group is quoted saying, quote, it is a shame that much has been redone in the house and on the manor as a whole. After all, only what is authentic can really stir the visitor's emotions. As long as there are still people alive who remember the time of Lenin, the opportunity must be taken to restore the surroundings true to their time, end quote. So here we have this very interesting concern for authenticity coming up, for actually also desire for an emotional connection to the past. And then while and after the construction of the museum reserve is completed in 1970, the guidebooks really praise the faithfulness of restoration, saying that visitors can, quote, imagine themselves transported back to the time of Lenin's exile, end quote. It is as if I'm visiting Lenin personally, and he just happens to be not at home, another visitor says. Coming to Shushenskoye, it is possible for the visitor to, again, step over the threshold of time. Or a visit to Shushenskoye is a chance of immersion in the life and history of our forebears, writes another guidebook. The past in these guidebooks so becomes ever more idealized, ever more perfect. There's a talk of tradition that rises, of ancestors. And towards the end of the Brezhnev period, towards the mid-1980s, Shushenskoye even becomes a escapist destination. One guidebook calls it a refuge from our lives that are, as the author writes, continually becoming faster. So if we wanted to put it into a table, these differences might look something like this. Before the late 1960s, we have confidence in the future, focus on progress, urbanization, and emphasis on the communist project, a condemnation of the past. On the other hand, from that time onward, the future is actually increasingly missing from discourse. The past is shown as something valuable for study, for immersion. There are themes of ruralism, an emphasis on the rural context, on tradition and ancestors, sometimes even with a hint of nostalgia or even spirituality. So, with this data in mind, having observed this breaking point, this rise of heritage and heritage perspectives, somewhere in the late 1960s, I went back to the literature and trying to find other cultural phenomena that I could connect this to. So, whereas the literature on the question of heritage that I'm concerning myself with here is still just taking shape, scholars such as Denis Kozlov have noticed comparable cultural shifts. Kozlov, for instance, referred to the historical turn in his discussion of the literary trends of the 1950s and 1960s, perhaps the most important of which was the phenomenon of village prose, whose writers, such as Vladimir Soloukhin, expressed very similar romanticism and nostalgia about the villages of old Russia, as we're seeing in the discourse around Shushenskoye at that time. Kathleen Partey summarizes the main intellectual motivation of village prose as such, quote, the Promethean drive towards the future had been inverted, had become the worship of a lost golden age, she writes. And I think that is very apt to what we're seeing in Shushenskoye as well. Katerina Clark, in a similar way, characterizes village prose as obsessed with the evils of life in the modern age. She writes that its collective verdict is that somehow the country has lost its way to the golden age and will not find it again merely by readjusting the present. She says that, quote, writers began to recommend a journey far away from Moscow, not in place, but in time, end quote, underlining this temporal reorientation of Soviet society that was expressed in village prose. And this development in literature is not the only comparable phenomenon. Susan Reed, for instance, observed an obsession with memory in Brezhnev-Era painting, whereas more recently, scholars such as Victoria Donovan, Catriona Kelly discussed respectively the rebirth of Krayevedenia, the study of local lore, and the development of architectural preservation, for instance, in St. Petersburg. Tom Cubbin recently wrote about changes in design in the Brezhnev period, where you have a return of historic motifs, also in city planning. Adrian Jacobs has observed that even in Soviet cookbooks at this time, there is a discourse of returning to traditional foods and methods of preparing food. Other scholars have recently written about discourses of spirituality and traditions in the Brezhnev period. For example, Katil Saleh, who very aptly has shown the rehabilitation of the notion of duchovnost, so spirituality in the Brezhnev era. And I think that all of these phenomena are really puzzle pieces indicating a larger cultural shift in the Soviet Union at this time, one that is really characterized by its temporal orientation, by its attitude towards time, history, the past, and the future. And in terms of heritage, that becomes quite clear if we look just briefly at some of the developments in the heritage preservation movement and legislation in the Soviet Union. On the one hand, there is the foundation in 1965 of the All-Russian Society for the Protection of Monuments in History and Culture, whose formation and development still needs to be studied even in Russian. Similarly, at the same time, heritage preservation became increasingly codified in the laws of the Soviet Union over the course of the 1960s and 70s, reaching its high point in the later Brezhnev-Era in the Constitution of 1977, where it said that, quote, "To care about the preservation of historical monuments and other cultural valuables is the duty and obligation of every citizen of the USSR." So this is another development that fits very well with the other cultural phenomena we have seen and with this gradual turn in the data in Shushenskaya. Now, what could be seen as the reason for this cultural shift towards the historic, which gave birth to heritage as such? Some observers, notably Brutny, have suggested that the Soviet Union's leadership was faced with an ideological vacuum after the death of Stalin and eventually sought to fill this vacuum through support for conservative forces that emphasized nationalism and a discourse of traditions and history in order to hold the Soviet Union together. Now, while Brezhnev certainly emphasized traditions and history in his culture of governance, what we actually see is that this turn towards the past, this appreciation of heritage, is really only a marginal concern in the Khrushchev period, leading me to think that the death of Stalin and this idea of the lack of an ideological linchpin in that sense were perhaps only secondary reasons for this turn at that time. More recently, John Dunlop explained the growth of interest in history as an, quote, elemental pressure, a change in the mood of Russian society. And if we take into account the breadth of cultural phenomena here, you know, when you have even art and literature that was implicitly often critical of Soviet power, like village prose, relying a lot on these historical tropes and ways of argument, I think that one could much rather tend towards Dunlop's argument and see this less as a top-down development, but rather really as a general shift of thinking amongst the Soviet population. Now, in my research, I'm theorizing the shift with the help of the German historian Reinhard Koselleck. One of Koselleck's most important contributions was his conceptualization of what he called the threshold time, or Sattelzeit in German. In his view, in the years 1750 to 1850, connected to the upheavals of the French Revolution, there had been a shift in European thinking about time, an acceleration, a perceived acceleration of life as it was experienced, through which actually the modern notion of the past as something distinct from the present was born. And with it came into being the very discipline of history as something that could be studied, as something that could be made an object of research. And I was wondering whether it would be possible to perhaps grasp a similar shift in roughly the Soviet 1960s, at whose end does not stand history, but rather heritage. Now, Koselleck uses two conceptual terms to discuss his theory about temporality, namely the space of experience and the horizon of expectation. Essentially, the space of experience is the knowledge that we have about the world we live in, our present world, but also our past, its customs, traditions, our shared life world, and our actions in the present. And on the other side stands the horizon of expectation. It's what we expect, what kind of future, a notion about where we are heading, perhaps to some kind of utopia, some kind of salvation. Now, Koselleck says that at the time of his threshold time. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars led to a complete rupture or reorganization of these mental structures. On the one hand, the space of experience became unrecognizable as the reshaping of Europe took apart traditional ways of life. On the other hand, history began to appear to move ever faster, and the future, which previously had been certain as part of Christian narratives, had now become completely unclear. And if we believe Koselleck that this rupture brought forward a new view on history and on the past, perhaps we can find comparable developments in the Soviet Union that brought forward this shift in the discourse on heritage, on history and heritage that is evident in Shushinskaya. And for that, we can just take a look at the developments within the thaw and in the early Brezhnev period. Now, the Khrushchev period was still marked by a very strong belief in the future, which had, as we've seen, always been a hallmark of official Soviet ideology. The overcoming of the shackles of the past through scientific advancement had always been an important element of Soviets' discourse, of official Soviet discourse. And of course, Khrushchev in the late 50s and early 60s promised that the Soviet Union would not only catch up with the US, but actually overtake it in all economic indicators. At the 22nd Party Congress in 1961, Khrushchev even promised to the delegates that the Soviet Union would reach its goal of communism within 20 years. And by doing so, he expressed and established a firm horizon of expectation, a clear line of further development for the Soviet Union. And with Gagarin having just made his first space flight, who could have argued against Khrushchev? At the same time, the space of experience of millions of Soviet citizens changed rapidly in the Khrushchev and early Brezhnev years through the mass construction of so-called Khrushchevki, that famous Soviet paneled housing that offered a completely new, much more private life to many Soviet citizens who left behind their ancestral homes, their old villages for these new settlements, which of course often bulldozed over older structures. In the Brezhnev era, this trend, of course, continued, but with one important difference. The relative openness, optimism, and enthusiasm of the Khrushchev years was substituted by increasing repression. And as time went on, more and more doubt about the economic perspectives of the Soviet Union. Over the Brezhnev period, it became increasingly clear that even catching up with the US was not realistic. Yes, Brezhnev-era citizens had more opportunities for consumption, for tourism, other traditional pursuits of developed economies. But the idea that the Soviet Union was somehow still headed for full communism became unrealistic, even laughable. And even the party admitted to this, with Brezhnev in 1966 introducing the term developed socialism. And here I think we are faced with a collapse of the future-oriented horizon of expectation that opened the way for the period of stagnation. And as amongst others, Piotr Weil and Alexander Genis pointed out, it was perhaps the Prague Spring of 1968 that was the final nail in the coffin for any belief in a better future. So in the early Brezhnev era, I believe we see this very strong shift of temporality from a future-oriented perspective, which asserted the primacy of economic and scientific development, to a situation marked by a sense of disconnection from the immediate past and its traditions through the rapid progress and urbanization of the Khrushchev period, as well as one marked by a growing vagueness of the future. And you could describe this predicament perhaps of the Soviet population during the Brezhnev era as somehow squeezed between a rapidly disappearing past and an increasingly foreclosed, even threatening, unclear future. While the newly urban population had recently been uprooted from its traditional environment, even in the late 1970s, actually, more than half of city dwellers in the Soviet Union had been born in the villages. They at the same time had to contend with the stark disillusionment brought forward by a stagnating, a faltering economy that made a real future perspective increasingly impossible or improbable. And I would call this situation, this cultural temporality that I have just described, a heritage temporality. A heritage temporality because I think it is here that heritage as a cultural phenomenon has its roots. This was a society that had a need for the past on the political level, but also on the individual level, as an ontological anchor in a world marked by this double alienation from both the actually experienced past and the promised future. And I suggest to see heritage not as a phenomenon simply using or merely relating to the past, but rather as a phenomenon creating social and common pasts. And seen in this way, the cultural phenomenon of heritage serves to provide Soviet society or societies in general with something essential: the production of comprehensible narratives about the past, involving both material objects and the mobilization of intangible discourses about traditions, values, and origin stories, such as we saw in the recreation of a historical environment in the village of Shushenskoye. And seen in this way, we can, at least in the Soviet context, consider the cultural phenomenon of heritage the product and outcome of a specific interaction between the horizon of expectation and space of experience. During the time of this future-oriented temporality, up until the mid-1960s, activities like krajevedenie and heritage preservation were the pursuits of a minority and often even considered politically dubious. But when the futures promised and collectively imagined fell into doubt in the context of resurgent political repression and a stuttering economy, this began to change. The clear horizon of expectation of the earlier futurist temporality, connected to the Soviet leadership's promises of a future triumph of communism, began to seem firmly out of reach. At the same time, the present began to appear increasingly unrecognizable, and with it the space of experience of Soviet society. The leaps in modernization, urbanization that had marked the Khrushchev years meant that the Soviet space of experience had become, to use a term from Heidegger, unheimlich, unhomelike, or one of not being at home. And heritage in this way became a tool to stave off this unhomelikeness, a technique of past making, a way to make these comprehensible pasts. It offered Soviet society ways to restore their ideological and ontological fabric of meaning. And it is exactly heritage in its many forms, in museums, in narratives about one's ancestors and so on, that became a dominant force in Soviet culture at this time, really on the broad spectrum. And the temporality of Soviet society at this time, I believe, is best described by the term heritage temporality. So what is this heritage temporality? Using Koselleck's terms, it is the combination between the foreclosure of the Soviet horizon of expectation and the alienation from Soviet society's traditional space of experience, affected by urbanization and technological progress. And it is in this moment that Soviet society needed something to reconstruct this ideological and perhaps even more so ontological foundation. And I've talked in this talk about a variety of phenomena, pointed them out: design, architectural trends, literature, discourses of values, traditions, and heritage. All of these spheres of activity were engaged in making paths for Soviet society to find some sort of firm footing. And because this was a real need on the level really of the widest sectors of the population, this was not just a top-down thing, this was a shift in the entire direction of Soviet culture. So the heritage temporality, as I define it, means the product of this moment, of this combination of a foreclosure of future and alienation from the past, this moment in which Soviet society turns towards tools of past making. So in this new temporality, classic Soviet values perhaps are gradually turned on their heads, as we see in these guidebooks. If you remember the quotes that I had started with about the supposedly best way to honor Lenin. Before this rise of the heritage temporality, we have a focus on progress, Soviet achievement, on the Soviet power of transformation, on the Soviet future. The museum, the Lenin site, instructs people to follow him, to build the future in his name. But then with the heritage temporality, this changes. Instead of instruction, we have immersion, an inward-looking site. Instead of transformation, we have preservation, restoration. And instead of progress, we have traditions. So it is really this cultural shift in the late 1960s that I believe is best explained by looking at it in this way through the lens of temporality. Now, before I finish, beyond being a tool for a better understanding of Soviet history and culture, this notion of the heritage temporality is also a look here at heritage as a cultural phenomenon as such. Of course, when I call this a heritage temporality, I also ask myself, is this a pattern that happened perhaps in different societies? Combination perhaps of a burnout of the future, a collapse of the horizon of expectation, combined with a certain estrangement of one's own past, one's space of experience. And there is certainly research on the countries of the socialist bloc that would suggest similar patterns. I think especially on the GDR, there is a lot of research of what people have called the Prussian Renaissance. Martin Sabro calls it the rise of the heritage tradition paradigm in later GDR discourse. This is certainly a factor in the countries of socialist bloc, sometimes in different circumstances. But I think this is where it gets particularly interesting. There are also trends in the West of the same nature. If we look at the United States Historic Preservation Act of 1966 or the 1972 adoption of the World Heritage Convention, we find that this really falls into the same time period. Now, you could expand here, of course. There is a literature on this, on changing conceptualizations of the future at this time, particularly in the 1970s. But heritage has not always been discussed as a part of these shifts. I think these correlations between what I observed by studying these heritage sites in the Soviet Union and what was happening almost worldwide are very interesting because they point to an effect of a cultural turn almost on a global scale. And a better understanding of heritage as a cultural phenomenon thus helps us not only get a better understanding of the 20th century, but also can make us think about more general conditions, more general cultural responses to rapid change. And I hope that I was able to show you a little bit about how in this kernel that I started with, the difference in how people thought Lenin would best be honored, we actually see the reflection in miniature of a much more global turn. And with that, I end my paper. I'm very happy to answer any questions and thank you very much for your attention. And again, should I stop sharing? Let me put this on.
Yeah, I think you can stop sharing. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much for that really fascinating paper. I have so many questions, and I think I probably haven't talked to you about your research for like 2 years. So it's really interesting to see how your PhD has developed. I know, for example, that when I did my pilot study, what I ended up doing was totally different from what I wrote in my pilot study, like completely different, same thing where, you know, the research question I came up with was just not as interesting as I thought it was. So totally with you there. I guess, yeah, we can open the floor to questions. And if people need a couple minutes to think of one, I can certainly start us off. But sure, Christina, you have the floor.
Yeah, I was quick. So I'm working with very similar issues, something I call the historiography of heritage in a completely different time period. But this research on kind of textual popular materials about monuments. And this is, of course, typical controversy in heritage sites, also apart from Brezhnev-Era or the Cold War, this kind of lingering between past and future, thinking about François Hartog's works or many other authors. So in a way, it's in the nature of heritage and its preservation. But what I was thinking about was that perhaps this is a moment that allows to bring together Eastern and Western Marxism, because Raymond Williams in 1970s writes about this backwardness and progress always being inherent in a single moment and a single culture, and the kind of emergent and residual elements in each society and culture. So one of the points of contact between different variants of Marxism. In any case, I'm looking forward to your publications on the topic.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for your contribution, and I'll definitely look into that more. I mean, exactly like you said, I mean, I think it gets really interesting if you think about the global connections, because so often I think it's sort of conceptualized, you know, the Soviet world is sort of studied separately, but actually there seem to be, obviously there are all these cultural connections that I think is also through heritage and memory, you can find really these global turns that are very fascinating. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you so much. I saw Yevgeny first, and then we can go to Julie.
Oh, hi, can you hear me? Simon, can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, congratulations.
I hear you. I don't see you, but I hear you. That's enough.
Okay, no problem. Congratulations on what sounds like a very ambitious project. And at least the conclusions were grand. And also, I've been doing at the same stage with my PhD, which is on like Soviet spatiality rather than temporality, but temporality cannot get, you can't really push it too far away when you study space. So I would echo many of your conclusions and would point to very specific coincidences. I would say that if there was like a turning point, it was between 1959 and 1964. And that was done on completely different materials. So yeah, so what you're doing should stand in science forever. Now to questions. First of all, because you focused a lot on Shushenskaya, a single case, and I would ask you to elaborate a little bit. How do you expand from a museum to the Brezhnev-Era? In the invitation, guidebooks were mentioned together with newspapers and visitor books and so on. So what is the apparatus? What are the other sources? And what is sort of the structure that allows you to make this expansion of the argument? And will we see that, for instance, sort of a sub-question in a young Soviet town, you know, which has no history, a sort of heritage you can look back to, at least in the material sense? And I will finish there. If there's a chance, I will ask the second question later.
Yeah, thank you very much for your congratulations, and congratulations, of course, to you too. The other data points of my PhD thesis are the museums in Ulyanovsk that I've talked a little bit about, and actually the museum in Razliv outside of St. Petersburg. So two sites that similarly are connected to this ideology and memory of Lenin, where I am also looking at or I'm observing this very similar turn that is happening around the same period. It has a little bit in both of these sites. The circumstances are a little bit different. The articulations are a little bit different. In Ulyanovsk, for instance, there is this really quite fascinating debate that is happening, and maybe we'll do the next talk on this. But Ulyanovsk, I think I showed a photo for 1 second. There is, of course, this huge modernist Lenin memorial that was built at the same time as Shushenskoye, actually. But what you see there in newspapers, in documents from the museum's funds and everything, you see that in the late 1960s and in the early 70s, there begins a real debate between local kraevedi, so local historians, and these kind of modernist planners that still are coming actually from the center. So it's actually quite fascinating to think about it in that way too, and you really see how there's a shift in balance, and whereas sort of in the early 60s, you know, they are still planning to basically tear down the entirety of Ulyanovsk, the local historians more and more find their voice and say, we know we need to at least keep this, we need to keep this. And it's quite fascinating. I mean, I think you could write an entire book on this, how the city slowly, you know, they saved what they could save. So there are very interesting other aspects in these other Lenin museums. What allows me to extrapolate in that sense to the entire Brezhnev period. I mean, how I'm trying to do this is to look at really the wider literature, see if I was able to find cultural trends that I could connect this to and compare this with. And I try to point that out a little bit. And this is basically the basis of how these small cases in Shushenskoye, Ulyanovsk, and so on, for me, tie into the wider cultural shifts in the Brezhnev period.
Great,
did you have a second question? Sorry, Margaret, I'll let you do
No, no worries. I guess, yeah, Yevgeny said if we go through other people and then there's time at the end, he might have a second question. So,
oh, that's what he said. Okay.
Let's move on to Julie and then Stephanie, and then we will circle back around if there's time.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Margaret. Good to see you, and very good to hear your presentation. Simon, Margaret told me about your work, and so I was very happy to discover it. And I think it's a beautiful contribution, especially as you have this focus on a very precise case study. So you explain you have several case studies, but this is exactly what we need in this field of research on temporality and heritage, to which I try to contribute as I exactly wrote my PhD on the concept of heritage through the Soviet Union, and what does it tell about the relations to temporalities with a plural. And so I would really like to continue this discussion with you in more detail, but I would just maybe have broader remarks to start conversation. My first question would be, what about the present in your model? Because you focus a lot about the past, even though they are different, and I completely follow you, of course, in these new discourses on the new historicism, etc., etc. This is something that has been also well documented, as you show, and that so I follow you on that. I follow you absolutely on this idea of future, that the future disappears, and the temporality that was fixed at some time then was slowly disappeared also in the discourses. But then this disappearance of the future makes it somehow become I think we notice more a focus on the present. And so in the model also, what you call the heritage temporality, I call it the neo-presentism. So of course echoing Hartog, but more focusing on this idea of that there is an emergency to rethink what is the reality in the present, and as the bases are actually very unstable, there is a need to go in the past, right? But so this idea of rethinking what is the present, and so looking for new roots, also appropriate what is the past, what is history. But maybe could you tell us more, because in this very binary model that you show, they're very focused on past and present, even though they're plural. So could you expand just on that? And of course, this idea of the present echoes Hartog, and it was mentioned by Christina before. Not that I follow Hartog on every of his perspective, but I think on this point, on this idea of the fact that there is a global turn on temporality, maybe here, and this is something that you started to demonstrate, maybe here there is something very interesting indeed with UNESCO, but also in other regions in the world, and with this turning and crisis of time, etc., etc. So thank you very much, and looking forward to being in touch with you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Means a lot to have you ask questions, because I know you've been working on this. So thank you very much for your question. Certainly, I think I've looked also at Hartog's notion of presentism in the context of this, and this might certainly be an angle to look at this. Now, it's my understanding that Hartog, of course, he focuses in particular, I think, on the West, and particularly on France, but his ideas about east of the Berlin Wall, I thought, weren't quite as clear as they could have been. I mean, he talks about how actually it was the fall of the Berlin Wall that kind of rang in presentism also in the Eastern Bloc. But actually, what I've seen in my research is that this kind of turn, and you might describe it if you want with this idea of presentism, happened before that. Happened so the fall of the Berlin Wall was really not the deciding factor, but perhaps, you know, you might almost think of it as a consequence of these cultural shifts that had happened before. No, certainly I think what I'm discussing here has a lot of similarity to what Hartog is saying. Similarly, of course, this notion of perhaps being stuck in the present, like you're saying, I think definitely you're absolutely right in pointing that out. And I didn't quite get to discuss that in this paper, but it is actually in my thesis. So I would like to discuss that with you more.
Great, thank you so much. Glad you two got to talk a bit about temporality in the Soviet Union. Let's go to Stephanie, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I wonder if you could comment on the relationship between this return to heritage and the interest in the 60s and early 70s, a return to Russian Orthodoxy, and the kind of a revived interest at that time. An area that I've done some work in is the start of the Jewish movement at that time, where also there was often through first Christianity, a study of Christian sources, of Russian Christian thinkers, and then a movement toward also looking into their Jewish heritage, which led them, however, indeed, to a different future, one which they look for outside of Russia. And I also wondered how much this phenomenon that you described was restricted to intellectuals at the time, or did it seep downward to a more common level? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I mean, to start with maybe your second question, I think that as time went on, this was something that seeped down, as you said, to a more broader level. If you look, for instance, at studies of consumption in the Brezhnev era, there are very interesting works on how actually, as the Soviet citizens sort of moved into their more private apartments, they had the opportunity to kind of fashion their identity more through consumption. And one thing, certainly this was perhaps a more intellectual stratum, but people were very interested in, you know, using these markers of heritage, if you want, like the sounds of the Rostov bells, bast shoes, and so on, as markers of a kind of cultural distinction that showed that they were in touch with heritage, with Russian history, and this became, is my understanding, this became a wider trend as time went on in the Brezhnev period. How this relates to Orthodox Christianity, this is not exactly my research, but as far as I understand, of course, if you think about many of these heritage objects that were increasingly preserved, were also churches. And I think in Catriona Kelly's book, I mean, there's a discussion on the preservation of the church in Senaya Ploshad in St. Petersburg, that really shows you the complex situation people were in, because on the one hand they wanted to preserve this church, but they couldn't really preserve it as a religious object because it was too much connected, because of course there was still this this drive for atheism, particularly in the Khrushchev period. So they began, and this is what I read out of it, they began to perceive it less as a religious object than as an object of sort of Russian heritage, as an object of heritage, as an object of architectural significance. And that is very interesting. I mean, I think it's fascinating to see how sort of then these kind of religious motifs kind of creep back into sort of Soviet Russian culture, divested perhaps of their, but not totally divested of their religious significance. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I don't know if anybody else has a first question, or if not, we can return to Yevgeny for his second round.
It's lucky me, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yes, my second one would be, is that although I sort of, I'm very happy to hear your understanding that this was a very general trend that a lot of society has participated in, and that is my feeling from my material as well. And but still, discourses are created, are authored, you know, are made, and then they're distributed. They have lives, so to say, in histories. So there could be protagonists, and I would say it's likely that there were. And this leads me to ask the question about, have you found any such agents that have contributed more to the birth and to the growth of the discourse of the heritage in the Brezhnev era? And sort of a thought about that is Brezhnev just a period, or could you connect it to the style of governance of Leonid Brezhnev, as exemplified in recent Schattenberg's book, for example, where there's a lot of laissez-faire, you know, where many areas are allowed to be appropriated, and there's only a core of ideological core that is still sort of preserved by the gatekeepers from the body, but there's a lot of a free-for-all in other areas, and that comes from the very top, you know. So so it's about agency, and for the conditions for such agency, do you think they actually were created by Brezhnev's style of governance in a way?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, brilliant questions, of course. I think if what you're saying about Brezhnev, I think it is probably fair to say, I mean, as I tried to argue, this was not something that certainly not Brezhnev himself or anyone really decided, oh, hang on, let's do a little bit of heritage here to, maybe that happened on some levels, but really the phenomenon is broader than that. So I think you would be fair to say that this laissez-faire, as you call it, would be connected to that, of course. And then if we combine it with this need that I've talked about, that then the conditions for this growth of heritage were given because people could basically, you know, find these objects, find these discourses that often worked as culturally distinctive or distinguishing mechanisms. And that's where it maybe goes to your first question. I mean, if we look at these actors, I mean, if I look at my case study sites, then it's often local historians who really push the issue. I mean, these are people often that have a connection to their town, particularly when I think about Ulyanovsk, where there was a strong academic tradition, actually. I mean, several significant Russian individuals of literature, of course, had come from Simbirsk, as it was called earlier. So there was a tradition, I think, in Ulyanovsk particularly, where local scholars, local historians started to really find their voice. They started to also organize themselves in this VUPIC, to transliterate it in English, in this Heritage Preservation Alliance. And I think that if you look at my sites, it's often the local historians who find their voice and mobilize people around themselves.
Great. Thank you so much. I actually have a question, which unsurprisingly will be about Stalin. So I'm sure you're aware that, you know, under Khrushchev, there's a partial reckoning publicly with the Great Terror and other forms of Stalinist repression, obviously not full, and there was some untruth forwarded on purpose by the government at that time. And then under Brezhnev, there's a little bit of a rehabilitation of Stalin, then it goes back in the 80s and 90s. And then, of course, it's kind of swinging the other way now. So I was wondering if you think you see any connections between this look towards the past and often, you know, the pre-Soviet past, and, you know, this kind of glorification of Lenin as the father of the people, whether there is any connection at the time to kind of a small rehabilitation of Stalin, and what, you know, is there a pattern? Is there a connection? What do you think?
Yeah, very interesting question. I mean, Stalin doesn't show up in these heritage sites, even under Brezhnev. But I think if we understand perhaps Stalin, and I would be curious what you think of that, if we consider Stalin as a sort of you know, more broader symbol, then it's the question of how can we perhaps connect this to these discourses of traditions, to discourses of that are going into the nationalist, into the Russian nationalist, the Russian chauvinist, perhaps, direction, to consider it perhaps as part of this whole package. I think that might be interesting to see. I mean, absolutely, as you're saying, I mean, with Khrushchev being so focused on emphasizing Lenin and only Lenin, in his kind of official memory. This is something that can be seen in these sites. And then perhaps, as you're saying, this single-minded focus on Lenin disappears a little bit. And instead of that comes this discourse of traditions, of values, of ancestors. Now, it might be interesting to see in what way all of these things can be connected to perhaps this, I know that some people have called it sort of neo-Stalinism of the Brezhnev period. I mean, doesn't, which is of course, it's a pretty strong term, but it would be very interesting to look at that more closely. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you were saying about Russian nationalism, it would also be interesting to look at Georgian nationalism, because there's, very complicated views of Stalin there. But I see that Eniken has her hand up, so let's hear her question or comment.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for the great talk. I guess my question is more of clarification. Because in the Baltics, I think this turn to heritage in the Baltic Soviet republics since the 70s has been retrospectively really linked to critique of Soviet society and perhaps even resistance. But one of the parallel phenomena you discussed, the village prose, you also mentioned that it was critical of Soviet society. But have I understood correctly that actually you are not seeing this this heritage temporality as a critique or as a resistance to Soviet regime, but really finding a new ontological security and fabric of meaning for after this, for a closure of future orientedness?
Yeah, I mean, the context of my study really is Soviet Russia. So I didn't study as part of this the other Soviet republics, nor have I studied sort of other subdivisions of the Soviet Union where there was a strong, where this might have been connected, as you say, to criticism of being connected to Moscow or some kind of independence movement, some kind of nationalist, separatist movement in some sort. So because that would have complicated my research a lot, of course. I mean, that is something I think that a follow-up study would have to look at. How did these things articulate themselves differently, perhaps in the Baltics and in the Russian Socialist Republic itself? So this was something that I didn't look at in that context. Would you remind me, please, of the second part of your question again?
No, this was you have responded.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Now I got it. No, I got it. It was about criticism. As I said, I think this was a broad thing, and I think that perhaps it wasn't even people weren't even necessarily aware that this was something that perhaps went counter to the old Soviet ideology. When I look at some of these, guidebooks and what they write, I'm really struck by how they can, 10 years later, they write things that seem to be completely opposite to what they wrote earlier. And it doesn't, it's very curious. There really seems to be, to have been this shift that was, almost not perceptible to the people living in it, the people who are writing in it, so to speak. And so I'm not seeing this as a resistance movement, but really as this kind of slow, imperceptible, and at the same time fast cultural shift. Yeah.
Yes, thanks. Yes, I wasn't actually suggesting that it was a resistance phenomena in the Baltics, because it's this resistance thing is also a figure of memory in both socialist times in the Baltics. But just that, yes, that's often these. I think what is original about your talk is precisely that these things were actually sanctioned by the Soviet system themselves, these developments. And this is, I think, interesting.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I see that Julie has another question as well, so we can go to her.
Only if we have time, of course. Okay, because it's just a reaction to what has been said, because I think it's the question you just asked, Enneke, is really, I think the core of the issue is what is this about in Soviet Russia? What is this rise of heritage, and especially because when there is this need of also of these new discourses about the past. So Simon, you showed very well that there is also all this moment of even of fossilization of the past and returning to something that needs to be frozen into a certain idea of a specific past. But they are actually doing exactly the same with Soviet monument, with Soviet architecture. And this is the moment, actually, in Soviet Russia is one of the first country to preserve and to heritage-ize their material production, in especially architecture, in the 60s. So this goes exactly along the lines about what you said, Simon, that this is not about critique. There is a need to really to anchor a certain discourses onto some materiality somewhere, and to anchor a specific vision about what is history. However, I would say, and this is where your research, Simon, is very interesting, focusing on these case studies and on the different agency discourses and their also plurality, is that depending on where we are exactly in the different part of the Soviet Union, of course, it doesn't mean the same thing, especially of where, depending on where people are, because this new turn to heritage is very linked to patriotism, nationalism, and is often very closely linked to environment, to a new link to environment, and this has been documented. So it was just to go further in this idea of comparison inside Soviet Russia, then inside the Soviet Union, and then in the global perspective. So there is really this need of putting a multi-scale approach to this new heritage wave, heritage temporality, etc., etc. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I know that you've written about that in one of your articles, how exactly these sort of early Soviet monuments are beginning to become sort of part of the heritage preservation discourse. Now, what I'm looking at here mostly are things that predate, of course, the revolution. But I think that's a really interesting point to look at also how, you know, these early Soviet monuments began to be part of this preservation discourse. Absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we probably have time for one or two more questions if anybody has anything they want to add, or we can cut Zoom fatigue and log off.
Well, actually, I would like to continue a little bit with this discussion that the previous two questions have created, and suggest, request your sort of your vision of the usefulness of the two ways that have been suggested that sort of bridge heritage as nationalism, or as resistance, or as critique, with your idea of heritage as finding an ontology for the contemporary socialist experience, which are, I don't remember exactly, but I think Kozlov, when he discusses retrospectivism, he calls it an instrument of doubt, as far as I remember. So that's that figure, sort of, which is kind of in between a little bit, or it could be argued to be there. And another tool that has been suggested by Jurchak, the inside out, how you know that thing, what's it, ненаходимость. So if you have the strength to discuss the usefulness of these two potential bridges between what the previous discussants have said.
Right. I mean, I think it's quite interesting to think about what Kozlov said about doubt, and I think he calls it factography in terms of looking at the history, looking at history anew. And I do think that this is a very kind of stimulating perspective. I think certainly for a lot of the, I mean, this is going a little bit beyond my thesis now, I think, but if we go again from these local historians, I think, who often had reason to doubt the official narratives and who were in touch with what had actually happened. So I think that's quite interesting to see. Then you could perhaps think about how this this turn, and I'm kind of improvising here, this turn that was pushed forward by these local historians, like we discussed, was perhaps appropriated in some way, or whether it became less political as time went on. I think that's a very interesting perspective on it, certainly. Absolutely.
Great. So let's go quickly to Christina, and then it will be time to say goodbye. But yeah, let's do Christina's comment or question, and then, you know.
I mean, if each one has to have several questions. So just a few comments. Firstly, the slide that you began and ended with, this 17-year difference between the two quotes. I think I agree that they are symptomatic quotes, but just you have to be careful there not also to over-interpret, because the same author might have changed in time, might not want to repeat oneself. There are several other issues at stake there as well. Then about Hartog, yes, Berlin Wall, but his whole research is about this kind of moments of kind of crisis of time or rupture. So you could easily interpret also 1968 in that key, in fact. And also 1970s, third comment, 1970s, 80s as this rise of heritage studies as a field of research, which is parallel to those developments, could also kind of offer some fruitful points of further discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I mean, I'll definitely look at those things, and I'm very grateful for your comments. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Let's give Simon another round of applause, digital or real.
Digital applause.
Yeah, thank you again. Really glad we had a really vibrant discussion period as well. I don't know, Anakin, if you want to add any closing words? No? Okay. Well, this is the end of our speaker series for spring semester 2022. Follow us on Facebook, Translating Memories, you'll find it, for our other events, or you can look at our project website. If you just Google Translating Memories, we will come up. So great. Everybody have a great rest of your day. And thank you again to Simon and everybody who commented.
Thank you for the questions, everybody. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.